4-5, okay. This is Senate Appropriations, so we're continuing our work on the 2024 budget adjustment. Before we start, I think all of you have received a copy of the Dear Jane letter, or not.
Just a memo.
No, it says dear right on me, right here. It's different.
Oh, I get the wrong one.
Yeah, you do. About the budget adjustment.
It's posted it.
On
email. I emailed.
Got it on.
Oh, you emailed
to
it.
us all,
That's why. No, we don't have hard copies.
Would you like a hard copy?
I love hard
Okay,
copies.
I will print those.
Which,
So, some of the things, simply because of the time constraints that the House had to work on the budget adjustment. We've had conversations that need more discussion and maybe some flushing out. And one of the areas where what we have here, which is a challenge, is the revenue upgrade for this fiscal year, the 29 million. The House spent it all in the budget adjustment and the governor spent it all in its proposed 25 budget.
Yeah.
And we're back to, you can't spend the same dollar twice. So, we are trying to put some, sort of how to make sure that we're getting the maximum utilization out of the money. And one of the big areas that was not included in the governor's proposed budget, but was included in the House, and that was a $10 million, and it was just a general statement for grants. But the question really becomes one of how you want to put some definition around the grants and what communities, and the other is what do we have for opportunities to leverage any of that money relative to some of the options, because if we can get some leverage, obviously that gives us greater benefit to the communities that have been impacted. So for that reason, we asked Doug Farnham to join us today to offer his best thinking, since he's been immersed in all the different funding opportunities, constraints, et cetera, in terms of grants. Are there things that, for example, communities simply are not going to get, that they would have incurred expenditures, I don't know, for cleanup. We did do that. We did pass the bill around the tax abatement and the towns not having to pay the ed fund. And that's coming, I guess, through the House today. We passed it out very quickly. But are there ways in which, if you're giving an agency to administer money, you have to give them some specificity around the intent, and to make sure that there's the fiscal accountability and fiduciary kind of responsibility that goes with it. So we're hoping that perhaps you could share some of your thinking about how to make sure that we are using this money. I mean, obviously, several of the communities, and Senator Kirchlick represents both Montpelier and Berry, and that were directly affected, but other towns. I represent Hardwick, and they got hit, and Lamoille got really devastated. So it's not, it's an issue where we want to make sure that with the limited funds, somehow we're able to get them go as far as possible and being used as strategically as possible. So we're hoping that you can share some thoughts with us. So thank
Absolutely,
you.
Madam Chair. So I'll focus on the municipal side of the table related to this disaster for the moment, in that context, since the 10 million is related to municipalities.
Mhm.
So our current estimates for the June flooding place the municipal damage somewhere around 210 million. And they have a breakout of how we think that's going to shake out, where the burden financially will fall under the current emergency relief assistance fund rule. And that we estimate roughly 10 million of insurance through VLCT. That's still very, very early, right? That number could change. But I believe that's the cap on one of their aggregate policies.
Mhm.
And then based on the emergency relief assistance fund participation rates, we included believe it was 6 million in the BAA, and then in the GovRec budget, we amended that to 11 million. To try to make sure that we would have enough money on hand in that fund to cover approximately 50% of the municipal match related to this event. So that's not operating budgets, that's not revenue loss, that's repairing from the damages under the current structure of the Emergency Relief Assistance Fund rule. The state, we're trying to reserve funds to cover half, and the municipalities, the other half of that burden would fall on them. I haven't parsed exactly the level of PA damages by town, but I do know in general, just under 40% of the damages occurred in central Vermont. So for most categories of damage from the floods, it was largely concentrated in central Vermont, another pocket up near Johnson along that riverbed, and then some a pocket down in southern Vermont as well. So that's one of the financial pressures. After Irene, there was language put into that rule to allow the Secretary of Administration to publish an event specific version of ERAF. So to adjust the criteria for that specific event. After Irene, there was a cap put on how much match a town would be forced to come up with at, I believe, 3 cents on their grand list, I think was the mechanism that was used that time around. And that option is not off the table at this point. So I would say under the current rule, the municipalities would be responsible for 10 million of match just to repair and mitigate direct damage. And then AOA, I'm going to be continuing conversations on as the damage numbers come in, and especially like I'm thinking of Marshfield, where they had 4 bridges damaged. The damage relative to the size of their municipal grand list is just massively disproportionate. Of course, the size of the grand list is not the only factor, the financial health of the community, the existing tax rate. Like, I think there's a lot of things that.
Marshfield isn't going to be a wealthy town.
No, of course not. No, I'm just saying, we wouldn't look at size alone as far as whether or not a community might need relief on the direct match. And that pressure would be spread out over time. It's a special fund. So it could be managed through that rulemaking process in a way that could help relieve pressure of any really exorbitant situations. So that direct damage is one area. The next is the short-term need, the revenue loss in property taxes and loss of local economic activity. And I would certainly be lying to say that's not significant, right? There was significant property loss. The abatements are one element of that, the local economic activity, the local options tax that's lost. It's certainly a factor. The GovRec budget or the BA proposed to address that directly because when we looked at balancing the match need for the immediate repairs, the short-term losses, and then what we needed to invest in hazard mitigation funds, we weren't able to come up with the funds to address those immediate revenue loss aspects. One reason that we didn't propose that is that there is a program that FEMA runs called the Community Disaster Loan Program. And they've been sharing information with us since November, December timeframe. The Vermont Municipal Bond Bank has been evaluating the program, whether or not it's the right fit for some of our communities. I think it's a program designed to replace revenue with forgivable loans. And the loans are actually in rate of 80%. But under
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Senator Sears, I didn't hear over his cough. So could you say
the program is, it's a FEMA program,
Yeah.
so it's not streamlined.
but it's forgivable loan.
It is forgivable loans. Their general forgiveness rate is 80%.
Of the total value of the loan, or 80% of loans are forgiven.
80% of loans are forgiven. So a loan can
Totally
be
forgiven.
totally
Oh,
forgiven,
wow.
yes. However, under Vermont law, it does require a bond vote it's a 5-year program, I believe. It's either 3 years or 5 years. Community Disaster Loan Program.
Yep.
And it might not be right for all of our communities, but it might actually be beneficial for some of them. And it is designed to do revenue replacement specifically. That's all it considers action.
So if you had a business and it normally grows $50,000, that's what it would replace,
It would,
80% of it.
it would, if
No,
a town is
80%.
normally getting local option, sorry, Madam Chair.
No, the 80% was out of the loans that are, if I understand that correctly, 80% of the loans that are granted under this community bond bank provision, 80% are forgiven. They don't have to be repaid. That's the 80%. It's 80% of those loans end up being free.
So the hypothetical for Barry, more than 200 homes, I don't have the exact count, but several hundred homes at least were damaged during the flood. If those all came off the grand list or the taxes were abated, then that would be considered lost revenue. If the grand list does not recover and the tax rate isn't adjusted to make up for that loss, FEMA will give a loan to provide for that. Now, there is interest and the interest rates are not favorable right now. So that is a factor as well.
Okay.
So what's the time frame for that rebounding of the grand list? Do they get time?
The forgiveness period, I believe, is it's either 3 or 5 years, Senator.
So you're paying interest for those 3 to 5 years while you're waiting to see if your grand list rebounds, that's the
Yes,
problem
so
with that. Program?
it's far from a perfect solution. I do think some communities that have also had capital projects that are currently bonded. If you look at the bonding capacity in some communities, they might not have the capacity to take on additional bonds.
Go ahead.
So it does count as debt until it's forgiven.
And the trigger to have it forgiven is just if it's just based on that grand list rebounding, are there other conditions or just that's the.
That's the main condition, that I'm aware of. I don't believe there are other factors. It really is looking at, and it's not intended to provide, it's intended to replace operating revenue, right? The local option taxes or the property taxes that you were relying on.
If it's rebounds only partway, do they still forgive the whole loan or the stuff that's only forgive part of the
I
loan?
believe that partial forgiveness, the delta,
Yeah.
basically, they forgive the delta. So I don't think it's a perfect answer for every community on the list, that receives significant damage. But we have been working with the LCT and with the municipal bond bank to try to see if the program makes sense for any of our communities. So I do think that's one
Is there a
option.
nexus with the 10 million
Yes,
in terms of somehow, I don't know, securing the loan, backing the loan, I don't know, just could you explain the connection, please?
so the connection with the 10 million is that part of the, I believe part of the intent of the 10 million was to help with the revenue loss that municipalities suffered. So this program would replace that revenue from what it would be borrowed. And if a town was successful in accessing that program, it would be much more efficient to maybe help them with the interest
Well,
that
yeah,
they're
that's what
paying on that
I'm
loan.
wondering.
Instead of covering the principal, cover the interest that they're paying on that loan program.
Yeah.
Or even look at making sure that they've actually applied to that program and that it doesn't work for them before going straight to replacing the revenue. It is a smaller program, so it has been nimble and pretty responsive. So I do think that if the community engaged with it, we would find out pretty quickly whether or not it would work for them.
No, you can only have a certain time frame. Did I see, was that on your handout or did you say about 2025 to apply for that program? Or did that relief loan?
I don't know if I included anything about that on the handout.
Okay.
But FEMA does have, generally, they have a lot of deadlines that are related to the disaster declaration, usually 1 to 2 years after the disaster declaration. I don't know exactly when the window closes on that, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was some deadline for application. I know that there's no looming one this spring, right?
So the PA 404 program has a January.
Oh, yes,
That's what they're.
yes. So, that community disaster loan program, I do think is an avenue we should be exploring. Because it could provide.
A lot more than the 10 million that we ever provide.
Right,
I mean, or if we, in the ways that you're talking about, sort of interest or whatever, are there other options? I mean, do we have sufficient? I guess I'm wondering, even for the FEMA that we will get through the public assistance, do we have sufficient funds for the match for the communities now?
not at this time, Madam Chair. So,
So would we want to make sure that we are able to, I mean, is that another option to? I don't have an opinion, I'm just trying to sort this out. In other words, do we need the 10 million to actually leverage all those federal dollars?
I believe we do, Madam Chair. That's one reason we had,
That's what you can use it. As we know in this business, any dollar that we can leverage federal dollars, gives us much more than straight one for one all state dollars. So I'm just wondering, as we're having this discussion, where we are relative to making sure that we're drawing down every available FEMA dollar and have the match to do it. And, it sounds like we're a little bit short still.
yes, in the budget, we put $12.5 million towards hazard mitigation. And that would be roughly 1/3 of what we would be able to leverage if we identify all of the projects based on the estimated approvals from FEMA. Which is $40 million for a buyout program, buyout and elevation program, Swift Current, and $80 million for the regular hazard mitigation program, which can be used for buyouts, elevations, but also floodplain mitigation and reducing the risk to communities going forward. So to do all of that, we as a state would need $38 million. And so we put $12.5 million in the budget, and then we proposed an ARPA reversion construct that would route not up to the first 40 million of reversions. It would route 90% to hazard mitigation. And it would be put through a process that I can describe at some point. It's rather complicated, but it would basically allow it to function as general fund and be used for match for those hazard mitigation. And then all the hazard mitigation programs are at a 75% match rate. We're working with FEMA leadership, is no formal petition yet, but trying to get it moved up to an 85% cost share, which would, stretch the distance of those funds. And then if we exhaust all of the projects that we can do with FEMA, that 36 million, any remainder of that could go towards flood mitigation projects that aren't approved by FEMA, but are still in BDM and ANR's excellent projects to reduce risk. Their flood maps are FEMA, when I say there, I mean FEMA, their flood maps are dated, and sometimes the maps prevent them from approving a project that is clearly the right thing to do.
So how much would that, if we took 38 million bond money, that would generate how many million for the towns, municipalities?
It would be 120 million of mitigation buyout work, and that amount would mean that the municipalities wouldn't have to come up with any local match. So our proposal is for the state to attempt to cover 100% of the match on mitigation events from this disaster, which is not how we've always approached it.
So it'd be that 38 would bring in that 1/3. So it'd bring in,
Well, it depends on the match rate.
Right.
it's higher.
75.
Approximately 120 million if we invest 38 million.
It would draw down 120, yeah, so a total of about 100 and almost 160 total then between the state match and the.
Yes, yes,
And that's the ARPA recapture, or whatever you called it.
yes. ARPA reversion and reappropriation for flood recovery, flood match.
Can you use the ARPA money as match?
Not directly, Madam
No,
Chair.
well, we have a way of dealing with that, but
Yes.
I didn't think we could.
You're correct that we can't use it directly that way.
Okay.
But that's not a bad return
No, better than one for
for
nothing. I mean, just,
better than $2 for every
Um,
dollar we spent.
So this is more of, this is a hypothetical that I've heard proposed, and it would be more something that Treasurer Pichek or his staff would need to speak to. But one of the issues with communities that are fully leveraged is, could the state help secure that loan for them?
Right.
So that it's not necessarily on their financial accounting. I think that's a worthy question to work through. Because if we could somehow arrange it so that a community is able to get a revenue replacement loan, and maybe at that point, helping them with the interest is much more achievable than helping them with the principal. Then that might,
Particularly if
allow the
80%
situation
of
to
the loans are totally forgiven. You really wouldn't.
I think the cases where they're not forgiven is where the community actually recovered, raised its taxes, or had development. But I think, I don't think I'm being overly cynical to say, I don't see various grand lists based on historical trends. I don't see it growing massively in the next 5 years. There's a lot of recovery work, there's a lot of groundwork, so as much as I would love to see it, I don't see a situation where Barry would have such an economic boom that it would preclude forgiveness.
So where would the money come from for that program again, for that? Or if you were to use the money for the interest payments, what pot of money would that?
That, I'm admittedly, Senator, I'm going out a little bit on a limb here because there's no money identified in the GovRec budget or the VA for that.
The administration.
But are you thinking the ERAP or like the ARPA reversions, or you just can't say?
Oh, ARPA reverted, if that $36 million that's being, as we proposed it for FEMA match and flood mitigation, if assistance with subsidized interest rates was an allowable use of that money, I don't think it would significantly erode, the return on investment of that overall fund. But I'm sorry, that's a kind of a gut reaction, not necessarily something I've cleared with you.
So then what's can you back up to the tripping of grand? Can you just explain that again so I can get it in my head? Because I didn't really understand what you said.
Yes, apologies, Senator. So between now and December 31st, we have to have 100% of the ARPA funds obligated.
Yep.
I'm still getting the newest quarterly data reports in, but we're somewhere in the nature of 300 million, 250, 300 million that we still need to obligate by the end of the year.
Yep.
Our proposal is going to be to, if an agency does not have funds obligated by September 30th of this year, that we would revert those funds and we would reappropriate them to pay. ARPA guidance allows.
We do it through corrections. We've done it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of specifics, but essentially we could put it up to.
To convert the
47
ARPA
million.
into general fund to service and match.
Yep,
Right.
okay.
Right.
Yeah, I get that, but then beyond that, you talked about varying grand lists and
Disaster loan program people.
So hypothetically, if subsidizing the interest rates, so that construct could produce 36 million for FEMA match and hazard mitigation. If subsidizing those loans were an added allowable use of that money, then those reversions could go towards supporting the loans to a community like Montpelier or Barry or Johnson that experience significant revenue loss.
and how significant will the loss be? And what was the piece about the grand list?
Yes, sorry. So most of the revenue loss comes from the lost education taxes and municipal taxes for them. I apologize, Rep. Williams, if I cite any incorrect numbers here, but I believe that it's somewhere in the nature of $1.5 million for each of Barry and Montpelier annually, right? So we're talking about not just this year, which was a shock to the system, but they have reduced revenue production capacity going forward. Because many of those homes, it's going to take several years to decide if they should be bought out or if they should be mitigated. And
There's 20 applications, John.
right. Right, yeah, Johnson had a significant, railroad street, I believe, was,
Yeah, Railroad State's done pretty bad.
yeah. So FEMA would consider the lost municipal property taxes, and they would put it in the calculation going forward of how much their loan would be to support that delta in property taxes that Barry, Johnson, Montpelier, Ludlow are no longer able to.
Just on those buildings or the town as a whole?
The town as a whole,
So if the town as a whole grows, it's out.
that's the situation, I believe, where a loan might not be forgiven. Is if a town experiences growth, they might have less forgiven, or if they grow to the point where they're not getting anything forgiven, that would certainly complicate. Because I don't think FEMA looks at a growth in your expenses.
Hmm.
They would look at a growth in your revenue producing activity.
You know, from the damage that our communities had. I mean, how they're gonna come back, go through all that, and then grow some more to grow, so it can.
Well, I'm just trying to figure out, and where's the starting point on the growth in the grand list? Are you starting from the present grand list?
So they would take the prior grand list
Prior to
and,
flood.
and compare it to the
Prior to
flood.
That's your baseline.
And that would be your baseline, yes. The other element that plays into this is the disaster resilient investment areas is a mechanism that we're working on proposed in Senate Economic Development. And that would give municipalities a conserved parcel increment credit that would help them redevelop and replace those properties in the long run. Just the nature of this year, anything involving the ed fund is of course a very challenging conversation. So, and economic development has been considering that mechanism. It overlaps with this because it tries to help the municipality replace those structures.
Is that a federal program? Or is that a state budget?
It would be state funded, it would be a TIF-like structure, Madam Chair.
Oh. Yes.
And is all of these other programs you talked about, the help the municipality, would it flow through the ERAF fund?
So
Matter.
it would not, Senator. Right now, ERAF fund is focused on direct damages and repair. I think in the long term, there should be a discussion about what does the state want to commit to in terms of hazard mitigation in the long term. We commit to between 30 and 70% of your damage and repair match, but we don't commit to anything as far as mitigation projects, which actually mitigation projects have a higher return on investment. They reduce risk. They're good investments. We've just never been able to quite get there. I know it was discussed after Irene, but I do think how we approach hazard mitigation, that's one of the things with Treasurer Pichek that we want to pin down as a recommendation on how do we approach that long-term hazard mitigation. The burden clearly should not be completely on municipalities to come up with match for mitigation projects. There's some kind of burden sharing there, but I can't say exactly what it should be by myself.
And the ERAF, how is that funded, or are we just appropriated into it? There's no funding source for it,
It's an annual top-off general fund process.
and there's based on a goal of a percentage or something.
Yes, so far, after Irene, I believe it took us several years, that fund went negative, it took us several years to kind of catch up with the effects of
On an
Irene.
internal service fund, so we put some money in a couple of years ago to get it out of deficit.
Is it based on like a
There's
certain
no,
percentage of something?
no, there's not a regular
It's
contribution.
just like, oh, let's try to put 5 million in the ERAF.
Yeah.
Right, and I mean, because it's related to damages, it really
Sure.
spikes and jumps all over the place. Mitigation efforts could be more planned out and more rapid, but this is really just a very responsive fund.
But when you talked about, so how much money was in there before the floods?
The events from the ice storms a couple of years ago, I believe the annual fluctuation had been in the $1 to $2 million range.
Around two.
Yes,
That's how much was in there. So not a lot.
Yeah,
No, it was negative and then we
It was
put it
negative.
to, and brought it up to,
it essentially goes negative every year. And then, in the VAA, we generally bring it back to zero.
It's not a lot of money, put it that way.
Right, so the money that the ARPA reversions, that when you don't have to run that through the ERAF, like when you talk about the rules of the ERAF, that only pertains to that $2 million.
No, the ARPA, correct. The proposal would be to have Vermont Emergency Management handle the, FEMA match and hazard mitigation funds from the reversion construct. If the uses were expanded and there were other things in there, like subsidizing insurance, the interest rates, that'd probably be a consideration of whether or not EM is the right entity to do that or not.
It seems like you ought to talk to the treasurer, when you're talking about getting
Yeah,
into that area.
I think
How do you
Michael
manage?
Godin or Gone, can't believe I still mess up his name. He's been amazing, since the disaster. It's really been nonstop looking for ways to provide the.
treasurer?
Finance.
Instead of bond.
He works at the municipal bond bank,
Oh, yeah, okay.
so I think as well as the treasurer, he's been putting a lot of time on this and would be really helpful.
Any other thoughts? Yes, go
So
ahead.
the 10 million how would. Assume the administration doesn't support what the House did with the $10 million.
That's correct, Senator.
So what you're presenting today is like, instead of just taking that 10 million, as the House did, you would rather do this because it's the same money. All right, not, but.
He's
some of it is
offering
the 5 million.
suggestions around if we, continue the 10 million, how we can use it most strategically and get the greatest return. But it's not gonna endorse,
Right.
anything outside the governor's budget, but has a lot of expertise in how to make sure if whatever that amount we're able to do, how to make sure we're getting the greatest amount of revenues to the impacted community.
But if we had that 10 in the 25 that's spent. So we had like 38 million, we could get up to 120 back if federal money. And that's where we get our biggest return, is paying that interest, letting them guys get that maximum amount.
And it may not work for Montpelier, depending on what's happening with their grand list, but you've been dealing with property values for a long time, so what the situation in Barry looks like and the extent to which they are already at capacity for any kind of debt. Or how you can somehow be kind of the guarantor, so, or the, assure the interest and it seems like that situation, I don't know about Johnson, for example.
I'm a little bit worried that outside of the village, that growth in the grand list might.
More than offset,
More than offset.
I don't know, maybe in Johnson, because I imagine there's some,
Yeah,
it's some very valuable property.
Yeah,
there.
but that's not in the village.
But if you just take 10 million in general fund and divvy it across all communities, it's
It's
negligible.
not.
Yeah, and you as well keep it in your pocket.
So, okay, all right, any other comments? You wanna offer the ARPA money, the reversion, that's not a problem. You can use it for payroll. And our biggest department with general fund payroll is collections, so that's not the issue. It's what can be identified in the amount that you have available, for reversion and obvious against that deadline. All right, thank you.
Thank you much.
So Representative Williams, you have your hand up, you wanted to, offer, you need to put yourself on the record.
If I may, Madam Chair, I apologize for not being on the schedule.
Well, why don't you just come down, you're here, and put yourself on the record, and obviously you've been involved in these discussions, and I'm sure I've had a lot of conversations with Mr. Farnham, as well.
I have, and I thank you for allowing me this opportunity impromptu to speak to this issue. As you know, Berry City was very heavily damaged by this summer's flooding. Estimates range between a tenth and an eighth of our grand list was damaged or destroyed. It's 517 units, apartments and homes that were damaged in our community. The rationale for our request, my request and my community's request and those Central Vermont communities request for the 10 million general fund appropriations in the VAA and the 5 million in ARPA is because of the time sensitive nature of making our communities whole. Montpelier and Barry have both postponed their town meetings to accommodate the Budget Adjustment Act already. It is our revenue impacts in Barry City alone are 1.45 million. Montpelier is 1.5 million. And the latest estimate from the league as of today from Ted Brady of the LCT is that it's 4 million for lost revenues from local option tax, parking, water, sewer and electric income, including Montpelier and Barry. And so while I fully appreciate Doug's hard work in trying to remediate our communities, my great concern is that the loans that we're speaking of won't come in time. And if they do not, only speaking for my own community, a $1.45 million impact equates to a 20% property tax increase for one of the poorest communities in central Vermont. And I don't think any community could handle that. That's putting aside the education component. That's just the municipal tax. I don't think any community could handle that kind of impact, let alone Barry. And I'm trying to speak for my own community here. Further, my understanding and interpretation of the latest details around ARPA funds, there is very explicitly language in the latest addendum to the final rule from the US Treasury Department that explains how ARPA monies can and should be used for natural disaster recovery and the assistance, the economic impacts therein.
Well, the issue there, of course, is we've appropriated all our ARPA. And
Absolutely.
so, even though they've liberalized the use, you still gotta claw back, wherever, it's,
Yes.
not gonna be used because some of it is in planning, some of it's obligated. So, yeah, we all got that, expanded, interpretation. It didn't make the pot any bigger. It just meant that you could,
Absolutely, Madam Chair. To that point, my concern is with the municipal technical or the municipal index program, I'm forgetting the acronym. As Doug mentioned, there's approximately $250 to $300 million in unobligated funds for towns. And that the assistance program, my concern, I'll just again use my statements. My concern is that those monies will not go out fast enough to communities before they disappear on December 31st of this year. And so my hope is that at least some of those funds, and this is why I believe my colleagues in appropriations, some of those funds will be used for immediate disaster recovery. I think the programs that the municipal match for FEMA assistance is critical but less time sensitive than the bridge funding. Completely understanding this is a unique series of circumstances. There's quite a bit of federal pandemic monies. While they are assigned to various state programs, they are extant. And there is a natural disaster that hopefully we will never have to see again.
I
But
wish I could say, be confident in that, because I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
So I think, this is, and so this is the, dilemma. So, and of course, some of the, I'm not sure what are, there are different pots of money. Certainly the last that goes through 20, we have to have it, but we have to have it all obligated. So we're tracking that, and seeing, do we have any of just the old ARPA money still sloshing around?
No, I'm sure the CRF money
Mhm.
is expended. The ARPA Capital Projects Fund is still largely at play, however, that's very narrow uses. So it would really help us for these.
And I'm sure Barry will go and use the money that they got for art, that went directly to the municipalities.
My concern, Madam Chair, is that we cannot take on any more debt than we already have to remediate this disaster. And any sort of debt, even if it's a forgivable loan, is that 20% does worry me, and I'm sure it worries many municipal officials. And so that's all I had to say. I do apologize for coming here today and speaking out of turn. If I did, I'm sorry, but has been a very hard year.
Well, I'm sure, I'm just thinking about all the disaster areas, the number of towns and the 10 million. I don't even think it's gonna give you the million that you say you need, the 1.45.
Well, again, the league estimates it's 4 million for lost revenue.
That's for
the
both
latest-
Barry and Montpelier, I think.
That is inclusive of Barry and Montpelier. Barry and Montpelier, my understanding, represents around 50%. All, is that right, Doug? All flood impact expenditures or expenses?
It like could shake out that way, Representative, yes,
Half the
40 to
damage.
50%.
Yeah, and so I thank you for your time and.
Okay, thank you.
That's about most work in the.
On the one town hotels, yeah, that's true.
Consider Thursday.
I think that we don't have a break, and I told the CUD folk I would meet with them at 2:15. And we have Brady who's gonna walk through the BAA. I'm just wondering, can we take a break now, come back, and then we'll start? Yeah. I know.